This week, a federal judge struck down Donald Trump's attempt to use the Alien Enemies Act to enact his mass deportations. It's a major blow to his efforts. It remains to be seen if the Trump administration will comply. Also this week, Columbia graduate student Mohsen Madawi was released on bail after being detained under equally dubious national security claims. And let's not forget Trump's beautiful tariffs. Overnight, one of his biggest sets of tariffs took effect, driving up prices on millions of goods. Michelle Hall, a Trump voter from Snohomish, Washington, tells the New York Times, quote, "Citizens are suffering. I wanted to have faith. I don't have that faith anymore." What do all these stories have in common? The arbitrary deportation sweeping up toddlers and legal residents alike, the crackdown on college students, the brutal tariffs hammering working families. In every case, Trump is doing these things not through the normal democratic process, but by invoking emergency powers. Not because of any clear and present danger, not because we're being invaded or attacked by college students or by Canada, but because declaring a national emergency or citing imminent national security concerns lets you do something unique in the American political system. It lets you bypass Congress. It sidesteps oversight. It gets you what you want, fast. For those tariffs, Trump claimed a, quote, unusual and extraordinary threat, end quote, from our trade deficit. But that's a complete distortion of the concept. It's normal for a country to run trade deficits with some partners and surpluses with others. It's not an indication of a failing economy. In fact, it's not an indication of anything, really. Nobel Prize-winning economist Robert Solow once explained the absurdity of this thinking using his barber as an example. He said, a chronic trade deficit with his barber who doesn't buy a damn thing from me. But of course, that doesn't mean his barber is taking advantage of him. The same logic applies to global trade. We export what we make well or have a surplus of, planes, fuel, agriculture. We import what others can make cheaper, like clothing. That's just how trade works. And Trump's math leaves out services altogether because we are the world's leading exporter of services. We run surpluses in industries like education, in entertainment, in finance. Okay, that's trade. No national emergency there. How about mass deportations? The president reached for a centuries-old wartime law meant for literal invasions by literal enemies of war and used it on asylum-seeking families. It's legally unsound, and this is important. None of this business of ignoring Congress and expanding executive powers started with Trump. Presidents of both parties have pushed the boundaries of executive power. George W. Bush gave us Guantanamo, where men were held for decades with no charges. Can't do that under the law in America. President Barack Obama expanded a drone war that operated in the shadows, often killing civilians outside of any declared battlefield. And let's be honest, when it's our guy in the White House, we often look the other way. Not because we're bad people, but because we trust him. He's on our side. We assume he's doing the right thing for the right reasons, even if that thing neither follows the letter nor the spirit of the law. We assume that power in the hands of someone we voted for will be used responsibly. But here's the danger. Every time we let our guy bend the rules, we make it easier for the next one to break them. Every inch one president takes becomes a mile for the president who comes next. And if that person who comes next is a would-be authoritarian, those powers don't just get stretched, they get weaponized. In Trump's case, the arbitrary emergency decrees mark a dangerous escalation, implementing them not as a last resort, but as a default primary tactic to force through anti-democratic measures. As my next guest who wrote a book on this puts it, quote, Nixon has been the poster child for abuse of power, but it was probably Trump who has been the most willing to ignore established norms of presidential practice. The lesson of history is that presidents of all political persuasions have been aggressive in their use of powers in pursuit of what they consider the national interest. Sometimes that's been for good ends, sometimes not. But if constitutional rules are going to have any meaning, they have to mean the same thing, whether we love or hate a particular president. Whatever powers you give to one group of presidents, say Biden and Obama, you're also giving to another, say Bush and Trump, end quote. What makes Trump different isn't just the abuse of power. It's who he targets. It's fellow allies, Canada, Mexico, Greenland. And increasingly, the targets are domestic. It's college students, journalists, critics, law firms, asylum seekers. The enemies are now us. Just this week, Trump said during a cabinet meeting that he's talking to some of his cabinet secretaries about invoking the Insurrection Act, a move that would allow him to deploy the military on American soil. U.S. law generally prohibits the use of military, federalized military, for domestic law enforcement. But the Insurrection Act creates an exception during, you guessed it, a national emergency. Critics worry that Trump would use it to suppress dissent, send troops into American cities, even cling to power after his presidency ends. This is why congressional oversight matters as a general rule, because when you look away while it's happening to others, whether it's Kilmar Abrego Garcia or Mahmoud Khalil or civilians who are being bombed by American planes in Yemen, you're perpetuating a system of impunity that could one day turn on you. And let's talk about Yemen for a moment. We are essentially operating as if we are at war with Yemen, yet no one has admitted we are at war with Yemen. And if we are, no one has explained why, unless, of course, you're lucky enough to be included accidentally in a signal chat with the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Advisor. And by the way, in the midst of this undeclared war with Yemen, America has lost 7 drones worth more than $200 million. Even under a conservative originalist reading, the framers placed the responsibility of authorizing war with Congress. George Washington wrote, quote, "The Constitution vests the power of declaring war with Congress. Therefore, no offensive expedition of importance can be undertaken until after they have deliberated on the subject and authorized such a measure," end quote. But if that's not enough for you, James Madison wrote, quote, "The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war to the legislature," end quote. That should be enough, but we have an extra hour today, so I'm going to quote from Thomas Jefferson as well, who said, quote, "We have already given in example one effectual check of the dog of war by transferring the power of letting him loose from the executive to the legislative body," end quote. Today, federal courts use a 3-part test to assess presidential power. If Congress explicitly authorizes it, that power is at its strongest. If Congress rejects it, the president's authority is at its weakest. But in that murky middle, when Congress stays silent, presidents act, and courts often defer. Now, with Trump directly threatening our democracy, quote, "we the people," end quote, are at a crossroads. Do we let emergency powers become a permanent workaround to democracy? Do we keep tolerating executive overreach when it serves our side, only to be outraged when it's abused by someone we didn't vote for? Or do we finally say enough? No president, not our guy and not the other guy, should be able to sideline Congress or govern by emergency decree. The Constitution was not written with good presidents in mind. It was written for bad ones who act like kings. That's what checks and balances are really for, to keep this nation from crossing over into tyranny. If we give up on those checks, if Congress keeps abdicating its role, if courts don't rein in Trump, if we, the people, don't resist, then the next so-called emergency might be the last one that Americans ever get to question. My next guest, the legal scholar Daniel Farber, says it plainly, quote, "There's a lot of constitutional law that happens outside of the courts. Sometimes it's pushback from Congress. Sometimes it's public opinion. And I think ultimately the public has to be involved, because when the Supreme Court acts, a president who is convinced of the rightness of what he is doing is likely to think it's still really important to do it, regardless of these pointy-headed judges. It's the question of what would the public say if you disobey a court? What will Congress say? Which depends a lot on the public. That's the ultimate check that makes things happen," end quote. And that means the safeguard is not just the courts or Congress. It's actually all of us. Here with me now, Daniel Farber, a law professor at the University of California, Berkeley Law School, and the author of the book on presidential power. It's called Contested Ground, How to Understand the Limits on Presidential Power. Professor Farber, thank you for being with us today. I don't know when you wrote your book whether you figured that this was for an audience broader than law students or people who are specifically interested in this, but suddenly we all need to become experts on presidential power. So thank you for talking to us this morning. I want your take on where we stand with the extent to which executive authority has been expanded the way we're talking about, using emergencies to basically make laws?
Yeah, I think you're right that Trump is going further than his predecessors in really trying to weaponize the idea of emergency powers. You're also right that he's not the first president to try to expand president's authority. That's really been kind of a constant, but I think we're kind of seeing a quantum leap in which sort of the tool of first resort is presidential prerogatives and emergency powers. I think, though, that we're beginning to see signs that the courts are not going to just roll over for this. And I'm hoping that we'll be seeing signs of increasing public opposition as well.
And I think the point you make about public opposition, I want to come back to that in a second, because if the public is in opposition, that should resonate with members of Congress who have to, be up for election or face their angry constituents. However, we see district court judges, federal court judges standing up to this administration about these emergency acts. Does it matter? Because ultimately, many, if not all of these cases will end up with the Supreme Court.
I think it is important that the district judges are reacting, and especially because it's not limited to Democratic appointees. In fact, the recent decision about the Enemy Aliens Act and the use of emergency powers for deportation was written by a Trump appointee. And I think that's important partly because the Supreme Court actually cannot hear everything. There are dozens and dozens of these cases. They don't have time to do all that. But it's also important because it's communicating to the Supreme Court that there is sort of a consensus among a lot of judges, a lot of lawyers, that something is going badly wrong here and that it's time for the courts to step in. And I thought, I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah, I thought that the ruling that the court issued at 1 o'clock in the morning in one of the deportation cases requiring due process hearings and saying that the courts were open for habeas corpus, it wasn't a total win, but it was showed that there is more than a critical mass of justices who are alarmed by what's going on and willing to take some, sort of unusual steps, right? They don't usually get up in the middle of the night to do these things. And I think it's a signal that the Supreme Court is really concerned about all this.
If you go back, you could go back to Obama, you go to Bush. As we've mentioned, a lot of presidents have done this. Is there a distinction between the things that those presidents did in the name of greater executive authority and these actual emergency powers, the idea that we've got a national emergency on trade, which has not been proved, or that we've got a national emergency because of an invasion of Venezuelan gang members, which has not been proved? Is that a distinction that matters?
I think it is. I think we're seeing both much more widespread of use of emergency powers, but also use based on much more tenuous justifications, right? I think the idea of an invasion by Venezuela into the U.S. is sort of an example of something that really nobody believes. And that's true of some of these other emergencies. The emergency, I do environmental law too, the energy emergency that supposedly requires more coal and gas fired power plants. Nobody really thinks that it's true that we do face some issues with the electric grid because of data centers and so forth, but nobody thinks it's an immediate emergency, and nobody thinks that the answer is just to somehow start burning more coal. It's really just a pretext for trying to accomplish other things.
So let's just look at this for a second. Is there a test? I mean, we don't know it as individuals, as Americans, but is there a test for a reason that a president has to be able to do something without congressional approval. We've seen this, for instance, at the beginning of wars, right, where the president makes a decision to bomb something, but then within a certain amount of time needs to go to Congress, both has to consult with Congress and then needs to get approval. We seem to be in this different area where there's no goal. The administration is not saying, hey, we'll get around to getting Congress to determine whether we're being invaded by Venezuela, or we should take over Greenland, or we should have tariffs. They're just not bothering.
That's right. I don't think they have any interest in asking Congress to approve these things because they know that would be really difficult to achieve. I think they also are reacting to the frustration that a lot of Americans feel with Congress being unable to act with congressional gridlock and polarization. And so there's the solution of the Trump administration is just to forget about Congress and sort of, Rambo their way through everything.
Yeah, that's a good point. All of these things, these executive actions, and the fact that they're not going to Congress, you're dealing with topics that are generally unpopular with the American public. So it feels like, okay, whatever. You're dealing with immigrants and you're dealing with all sorts of things that I don't care about, and I don't care about Congress anyway. So it helps smooth the way for the Trump administration.